What does success look like for you? If you could have it all, what would you have? The dream life for many people in our culture and our context is to have enough money to not have to worry. Now that's what we say, but in reality, we want more. We want to have enough money to be able to do whatever we want whenever we want it. We want the big house, the fancy car, the luxurious holidays. And why stop there? Throw in the private jet and a huge yacht. And whilst you're at it, why not also have a handful of staff to look after you and clean up behind you? If I was to say to you that I could give you all of that and all I had to do was click my fingers and that life would be yours, would you want it? I would struggle to turn that down. It's the American dream. It's also the British dream, but we're a bit too reserved to admit it and to own it, that we still dream about it. Now, a few thousand years ago, Jesus walked onto the pages of history and he pronounced to all who would hear that I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. That they are the people who choose to follow him. Jesus promised his followers fullness of life, abundant life. It's life filled to the rafters, life to the max. Now, I'm one of these followers. I wasn't there when Jesus said it. I'm not that old. But I, like everyone who chooses to follow Jesus, is included in this promise. This abundant life is the life that Jesus offers to me and to you if you follow him. Now, perhaps you are a Jesus follower and you've heard this invitation, but when you take a look at the life that you're currently living, you wonder where it is. Is this the life that Jesus promised us, or is there more to come? Perhaps you're a Jesus follower and since choosing to follow him, you've noticed that your life has gotten more difficult and more challenging. Is this the life that Jesus promised us, or is there more to come? Now, this is part one in a new series of messages exploring an aspect of the abundant life that Jesus has promised us. If you're a follower of Jesus, then this series might be a challenging reality check for what Jesus really has invited you to. Now, if you're someone who's curious about faith, if you're exploring faith and wondering, if this is for you, then this series might actually cause you to think again. We're talking about disruptive faith. The point of this series is that faith in Jesus should disrupt our lives. It should get in the way. Now, on one level, faith should make life more difficult and challenging. And this can sound like a million miles away from Jesus' invitation to fullness of life. The reason we struggle with this is because we think life to the full is more about the stuff I mentioned earlier. We naturally think about having what we want when we want it. That's a fat life, not a full one. And I'm not spelling fat with a PH. Jesus offers us a full life, an abundant life, not an indulgent one. Now, I still remember the words that my principal at my sixth form college said to us in an assembly when we started. It was quite a few years ago, but these words have stayed with me. If something isn't challenging, it's not worth doing. And I think it's based on a Theodore Roosevelt quote where he said, nothing worth having comes easy. The full life that Jesus has for us isn't an easy one. It's the opposite. But it is one worth having. It's a life worth living. It's a life full of meaning and purpose. It's a life with destiny. But let me be really clear. It's a life that will get in the way and disrupt the rest of your life. So let's drop in on a conversation that Jesus had with his first followers. Both Matthew and Luke recorded this for us, and we're going to take a look at Matthew's version. In chapter 16, which is just over halfway through his gospel, we see this major turning point. It's like a light bulb moment for Jesus' first followers. He's taken them on a field trip to Caesarea Philippi. That's about 30 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. And whilst he was there, he asked his disciples, who do the people say I am? Now, there was great confusion over who Jesus was. Some thought he was John the Baptist, others thought he was Elijah, and others thought he was just another prophet. And Jesus then looks at his disciples in the eye and he asks, what about you? Who do you say I am? It was an interesting place to ask this question. Caesarea Philippi was a place focused on the worship of other gods. The Canaanites built a sanctuary to Baal there, and it was also the place that Jeroboam built an altar with golden calves, describing them as the God who brought the people out of Israel. Now, in Jesus' time, Caesarea Philippi also contained a shrine to the pagan god Pan, a temple to Zeus, as well as temples and shrines to a bunch of other pagan gods. This cave was also known as the gates of Hades or the gates of hell. They thought it was the gateway to the underworld. And is it a coincidence that Jesus chooses to ask this question, who do you say I am, in this place? I don't think so. Now, Peter is the first to speak up, and his answer is amazing. He says, "You are the Messiah. You are the Son of the living God." Now, this was a dangerous thing to say. To declare Jesus as the Messiah and as the Son of God was blasphemous in their Jewish culture. It was punishable by being stoned to death. And this declaration was also a direct threat to Caesar, who thought of himself as God. This place is called Caesarea Philippi after Caesar. And there was this huge temple built to worship Caesar Augustus in front of Pan's grotto. Declaring Jesus as divine was a direct challenge to Caesar, as well as being a shun to the pantheon of other gods that this geographical place was known for. This declaration that's recorded by Matthew is a turning point because it's where they finally get it. They finally understand and see who Jesus is. He's the Messiah that they'd been waiting for, the one whom had been promised to Israel to restore them. But Jesus is more than the Messiah. He's also the Son of God. That statement means that he is God. The people of Israel believed in the coming of the Messiah, but they didn't expect him to be God. This is a high point for Peter, but he's about to come back down to earth with a bump. This is how Matthew records what happened next. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, and you do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Now, these words are in stark contrast to what they expected the Messiah to be and to do. They thought he'd be a mighty warrior, a great king who would kick out the Romans. They'd destroy them in battle and re-establish Israel as a mighty nation. And they just found the Messiah, but now he's talking about being handed over to the religious leaders and being killed. No wonder Peter rebukes him. And Peter's just found a new level of faith in Jesus. This man isn't just his rabbi, he's his Messiah and he's his God. But almost immediately this faith is being threatened. Peter would have grown up longing for the coming of the Messiah. He would have undoubtedly shared the dream about who the Messiah would be and what he would do. But it was a dream that was focused more on themselves than on God. Jesus doesn't fit the mold they were expecting. He isn't the mighty warrior or the powerful king that they'd hoped for. He was entirely different. And Jesus is disrupting their worldview. That's part of the reason why Peter responds the way that he does. Jesus' response to Peter comes across a bit harsh. Peter's just looking out for him. It seems a bit unfair to call him the devil. But this links back to the temptations that Jesus faced in the desert after his baptism. One of those was to not have to suffer and bypass the whole dying bit. Instead, the devil will offer him all the kingdoms of the world, which wasn't actually his to give. And in return, Jesus just has to bow down and worship him. Do you know what Jesus said to him? "Get away from me, Satan." I wonder if Jesus responds in this way to Peter because he sees that familiar temptation to take a shortcut, to not go through with what was laid out before him. But if these words sound challenging, they've got nothing on what Jesus is about to say. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they've done. Now listen to the first part of those words again. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and following me. Denying ourselves is not what we first think of when we think about living life to the full. That's not part of the dream. It's more of a nightmare. Take up their cross and follow me has new meaning for us as we hear these words after Jesus has been crucified and resurrected. We see the imagery of sacrifice and surrender in them. But I wonder what his first disciples thought as he spoke them. Now, they would know all too well the scene of each poor criminal carrying their cross through the streets of Jerusalem, taking it to the place that they'd be executed. This punishment was reserved for the worst criminals, the one who tried to overthrow or threaten the Roman Empire. It was an act of humiliation, requiring the criminal to surrender and to submit. Jesus is inviting them to surrender their way, their dreams, their aspirations, and pick up his. For Peter, that meant to lay down the dream of Israel rising up against the Romans, defeating them in battle and kicking them out of their land. For us, it's something entirely different. What is the dream or the aspiration that Jesus might be calling you to surrender, to lay down in order to pick up your cross and follow him? Now, God isn't some killjoy trying to stop you having fun. Everything he does is for our ultimate good. The problem is it can sometimes be difficult to see it. Now, any parent who's tried to get their kids to eat vegetables instead of sweets understands this tension. Look again at what Jesus said next. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? If I'm honest, I'm not totally sure what Jesus means here. See, all but one of the 11 remaining disciples ended up being martyred for their faith. They literally lost their lives. The one who wasn't martyred was exiled to the island of Patmos to live out the rest of his life. And some people think he later escaped, but was then boiled in oil in Rome. Jesus is speaking these words to his disciples, but he's also speaking them to us today. They had literal meaning for his first followers, but what about us? Now, I don't think Jesus is saying to us that to find life, we have to die an horrific death, like the first disciples did. But let's just pause there a moment and think about that. These first disciples were so convinced that Jesus was who he said he was. They were so convinced that Jesus had been crucified and then came back to life, that they were so convinced that he was both the Messiah and God, that they were willing to be executed for their faith. They weren't making this up. They didn't make up the whole story about Jesus coming back to life after he was crucified. If they did, surely they would have admitted it to escape the brutal fate that awaited them. This is one of the most convincing things for me as why I believe that Jesus is who he says he is and that he did the things we believe he did. I don't think Jesus is saying to us that we have to be martyred for our faith in order to discover the fullness of life that he has for us. But I do think he is saying that part of us has to die in order for us to live. It's the same part that the original disciples allowed to die, that part of us that is all about us. Jesus told us that whoever wants to be his disciple must deny themselves. This is about choosing to not put ourselves in the spotlight. It's about choosing to not make ourselves the center of our universe. Peter had to learn to deny himself in order to let go of his cultural expectations about who the Messiah would be and what he would do. Just as we have to deny ourselves by letting go of our cultural understanding of what fullness of life is all about and how it's found. Now, this isn't about settling for less. It's actually about discovering more. Peter's hope for a Messiah would be for a person to help them in their part of the world in their time. And Jesus comes and blows that out of the water. He didn't come to restore Israel and help them defeat the power of the Roman Empire. He came to restore the entire world and to help us all defeat the consequence of sin by overcoming the power of death. They were hoping that the Messiah would be a military leader, perhaps even a king. Jesus is far more. He's God. So often we think a full life is about money and power and status. We think a full life is about having what we want and being able to do what we want. And this spills over into our faith life too. We think God's job is to keep us safe, to cater for our needs, and to do the things we ask of Him. We question God when life is hard, and we start doubting His existence when we experience suffering. This is not the life that Jesus offers us because it isn't life to the full. So often we think a full life is about money and power and status. We think a full life is about having what we want and being able to do what we want. And this spills over into our faith life too. We think God's job is to keep us safe, to cater for our needs, and to do the things that we ask of Him. And we question God when life is hard, and we start doubting His existence when we experience suffering. This is not the life that Jesus offers us because it isn't life to the full. So often in our desire for more, we end up settling for less. How much of our life is life-giving? How much of the things we do or focus on actually bring us life? How much of it restores us and helps us? There are quite a few things that our driven, individualistic culture runs after because we think it's about living life to the full, but it actually does the opposite. Instead of helping us live, it's killing us slowly from the inside out. There's a paradox happening before our eyes. The things we think are all about life end up killing us. That's why Jesus offers us a new way, another paradox. Instead of living to die, He invites us to die so we can live. The life offered to us in Jesus is far more than the one we tend to go after. It's far more fulfilling and far more rewarding. It has far more purpose and meaning, and it's far more challenging. If something isn't challenging, it's not worth doing. Following Jesus should stretch you, it should challenge you, it should get in the way and disrupt your life. But through all of that, it should result in the abundance of life that Jesus came to give you. It should be life-giving. So what's going on in your life and your attitude towards faith that isn't helping you live the life that Jesus has for you? What actions, attitudes, or belief are killing you or the relationships around you? What aspect of your life is actually taking away your life? What do you need to allow to die in order for you to discover the life that Jesus offers for you? Pick up that cross and start following.